during diastole, when it relaxes, it fills up with blood. And then during what we call systole, it contracts. And how long does it have to contract? Well, if your heartbeat is 60 beats a minute, that's 1 second, 1001. And that's when it has time to contract and relax, right? So it only has a few pieces of a second. And if your heart rate is, say, 80 or 90, it might only have less than 1/3 of a second to contract and push that blood out. So let me ask you, how can it do that? How can, in other words, physically, thinking physics here for a moment, how can this muscle eject a 1/2 cup or a 1/4 cup of blood out of itself in less than 1/3 of a second? Well, the reason that that can happen is because the aortic artery that's just at the top of the heart, it expands. It actually takes the blood from the heart and expands and has this what we call bolus, which then starts to move and dissipate as the blood circulates. So what I'm trying to help us understand is that the connection between the heart and high blood pressure is stiff arteries. And what have we talked about that makes the artery walls stiff? Atherosclerosis. So at one point in our presentations, we were telling you that the common denominator of much chronic disease is actually atherosclerosis, this stuff that injures the blood vessels. And here we are again talking about blood pressure, and it's, to a large extent, it's about atherosclerosis. You know, the atherosclerosis, there are people who are linguists or whatever, and they love words. Well, I'm not a linguist, but I do love knowing about words. And that is a 3-part word, atherosclerosis. And it is soft, hard condition. That's what those words mean. So we have a condition that has these soft sort of plaques that they start off soft inside the blood vessel. They harden over time, and that's what makes the walls of the vessel so stiff. So atherosclerosis. All right, so another question. Last night we talked about heart disease, and we talked about how many times this pump cycles in a lifetime. And since I don't have a way to get your answers from the audience, if I did, I would ask you how many was it. But anyhow, the number was about 3 billion. About 3 billion times that this muscle contracts, pushes blood into the artery, and so that artery is doing the same thing. 3 billion times it is expanding and contracting, expanding and contracting. So that's why blood pressure is such an important matter. And in fact, I don't know if you're aware of this or not, but the most significant disease associated with high blood pressure is actually not heart disease, it's stroke. The elevated blood pressure increases our risk of stroke, which is basically a heart attack in the brain, more than anything else. So let's see what the doctors will tell us tonight, and then we'll have a little discussion afterwards. They finish. I'll make sure the sound is high enough.
This hose is a lot like your blood vessels. Vessels to increase. It's kind of like me putting my hand over the end of this hose. And as I do that, the pressure can increase on the inside, and it can cause all sorts of problems. For example, it can actually damage the blood vessels. As you can see, as I put my finger over, the pressure can actually cause a kind of leaking. And we call that leaking on the inside an aneurysm, and obviously that's life-threatening. But there are other things that high blood pressure can damage as well, including our brains, our kidneys, our eyes, and of course our heart. In this session, we learn what we can do to keep the pressure down. Are you ready for another story? This is the story of one of my dear colleagues who at a young age had to face a harsh reality. "No," he cried, "that only happens to old people. No, I'm barely 18. How can I be paralyzed? How could I have a massive stroke?" Well, his parents had lived through the Great Depression, and they had vowed that their children would never suffer like they did. And so they provided well. And after 47 years, here's what Dr. John McDougall describes it now in his most recent book. "I grew up eating bacon and eggs for breakfast, sandwiches stuffed with meat and slathered with mayonnaise for lunch, and beef, pork, and chicken at the center of the plate every night at dinner." Ironically, no one realized it then that the best food money could buy actually nearly killed me. He describes his recovery as slow and incomplete. And then he adds, "Even after 47 years, I still walk with a limp, a lifelong reminder of the path that led to my illness and then to my newfound health." High blood pressure is one of the big 4 risk factors for heart disease, along with smoking and cholesterol and diabetes. Why? Because it speeds artery clogging. And then high blood pressure is also the biggest risk factor for strokes, dreaded because of its crippling effects. And then high blood pressure also increases the risk of kidney disease. And here are some stats. A person with high blood pressure has increased the risk by 3 to 5 times for heart attack and heart failure, and is 8 times more likely to suffer from a stroke than a normal intensive person. So to show you how fast the stroke risk can go up, look at the difference here 20 systolic points can make. Going from blood pressure of 120 to 140 would double the likelihood of dying from a stroke or heart attack. But going from 120 to 160 would actually double that risk once more. It would actually then quadruple it. Since we now better understand the risk levels at various blood pressure points, we can see why the optimal blood pressure levels have been set at 120/80 or less. So if 120/80 is ideal, then what is defined as the disease? Well, hypertension is really best defined on several readings at 140/90 and above. So anything above 140/80 is hypertension. It can be either number or both numbers, the systolic or the diastolic number. If one is at the level or higher, the definition kicks in. Now, if 120/80 is the optimal bookend, and 140/90 is the other bookend, then everything in between is called pre-hypertension. These are the very people who want to do all they can in not becoming full-fledged hypertensives. Let's take a look at the American scene. Here, every second adult either has pre or full-blown hypertension, both with an accelerated risk for cardiovascular disease. Here are the stats. Of the 65 million people with high blood pressure, 20 million don't even know they have it. And another 10 million try to get by without medications. And 35 million are on medications, yet only half of them will still take them as ordered after 6 months. While we don't fully understand the exact cause of essential hypertension, there are 6 very definite and understandable contributing factors, largely rooted in nutrition. Number 1, sodium or salt. Dr. Gleiberman studied 27 populations around the world and found a direct straight regression line, powerfully connecting the salt intake and the blood pressure levels. Those societies and cultures with the lowest salt intake also had the lowest blood pressure, and those with the highest salt intake had the highest blood pressure. The higher the salt, the higher the blood pressure. These initial population studies were recently augmented with the famous INTERMAP global survey of salt consumption and the prevalence of hypertension. What was their conclusion?
They said sodium chloride, commonly known as table salt, may be the #1 contributing factor in hypertension. The authors point out that many pre-industrialized people, such as the Australian Aboriginals, tribes in New Guinea, and people in Samoa, Africa, and Central America, actually consume very little sodium, generally less than 500 milligrams a day. And many of these societies are characterized by a total absence of hypertension, no high blood pressure. In contrast, people in industrialized nations consume between 3,000 to 5,000 milligrams of sodium a day, and hypertension has a huge presence. Here, interestingly enough, only a smidgen of today's sodium actually comes from the salt shaker. Close to 80% now comes from processed and packaged food and from restaurant meals. Well, what actually happens to all that ingested salt? Well, when we eat more salt than our kidneys were designed to cope with, then excessive sodium accumulates like a toxic waste that must be diluted before our bodies can handle it. So we begin to retain water, lots of it. At the same time, our blood pressure goes up as it tries to shove all that extra salt water through the kidney filters. These poor, overworked kidneys often diminish and wear thin in their ability as a sophisticated filtration system in time. And all too often, they may eventually lose their ability to function normally. So, point number 1 then is, let's be careful about sodium and salt when it comes to understanding essential hypertension. Point number 2, arterial plaque. You know, the buildup of atherosclerosis contributes to high blood pressure problems. Plaques have infiltrated our blood supply lines, inflammatory processes have emerged, and the arterial walls begin to harden. As these plaques now build up, they restrict the free flow through our arteries. And as a result, our blood pressure goes up in an effort to help us push the blood through these narrowed arteries. So we have to do something about salt. We have to do something about atherosclerosis. We have to do something about number 3, overweight. Because overweight directly contributes to the high blood pressure problem. As a matter of fact, obese people are 5 times more likely to have hypertension. And most of them will eventually experience high blood pressure. It's just a matter of time. So now we come to number 4, exercise. Exercise will not only help with the daily calorie balance, but it will also lower peripheral vascular resistance in your arteries, which facilitates blood to flow with greater ease. So build that into your daily program. That brings us to number 5. What about alcohol? Well, when it comes to bringing blood pressure and overweight levels down, alcohol is really contraindicated. When it comes to hypertension and alcohol, I think the least is best. And that brings us to our last point. Point number 6, sufficient potassium. You know, potassium is readily found in fresh fruits and vegetables. To bring down high blood pressures, we recommend 9 fruits and vegetables a day. That's right. It's the potassium that has been shown as an important teammate in battling hypertension. And it does it most effectively by counteracting the effect of sodium. Did you notice that every one of these 6 factors is under our control and jurisdiction? Here are 3 research reports to show how effective these principles can be in lowering blood pressure. Here's study number 1. The Predican Longevity Center in Miami brings people in for 4 weeks. They come into a beautiful place, they enjoy some education, follow a very simple diet to exercise, and the foods they have are very low in sodium, less than 1,500 milligrams a day. Very low in fat, less than 10%, and rich in fiber, and they have plenty of fruits and vegetables, whole grains and legumes, plus a modest amount of meat. And here are the results of 216 hypertensive patients who had been admitted to the center on medication for high blood pressure for at least 2 years. When they were discharged at the end of the 4-week program, 180 of these 216 patients, or 83%, were now normotensive, They had normal blood pressure, and they were no longer in need of any medication. And that brings us to study number 2, the famous DASH program, which also stands for the Dietary Approaches to Stop Hypertension. This program has been an unmitigated success in the treatment of hypertension from its very first publication in 1997 in the New England Journal of Medicine. 2 years earlier, funded by the National Institutes of Health, the DASH group screened over 8,000 some men and women. Out of these over 8,000 people, they enrolled 459 with hypertension below 160 and below 95 and not yet on medication. These participants then joined a unique 8-week feeding experiment with 3 groups. Number 1 group was the control group. They received the regular American diet. Number 2 was the high potassium diet. This is a diet that's largely centered on fruits and vegetables. And then the number 3 group was what they call the combination diet, centered on fruits and vegetables, plus plenty of whole grains, very low-fat dairy, legumes, and some nuts, and minimal animal products. And what they tried to do at this study, they kept the weight and the salt constant. They wanted to see if the change in diet made the difference rather than any weight change or sodium change. And here are the results. They had 133 hypertensives, and they looked at their blood pressures very carefully over the 8-week program, and they found that they were able to lower their systolic blood pressure by 11 points and their diastolic blood pressure by 6 points almost. And they said, quote, "This outcome is similar in magnitude to that observed in trials when patients receive one medication for high blood pressure. It is well suited for the prevention and for the treatment of hypertension." This is now the second study that shows that we can do something with non-medication approaches. And now let me take you to study number 3, the CHIP success formula. Of course, you know the program, whole foods, largely plant-based, very low in fat and sugar, and very low in salt, of course. And we push more fiber. And of course, we are also very, very careful with alcohol. And here are the results. Out of over 5,000 CHIP graduates, 454 enrolled with systolic blood pressures above 160. And here's what happened to them. At the end of the 4-week program, this high-risk group had been able to drop their average blood pressure by 23 points. The systolic blood pressures came down 23 points. Similarly, 210 enrolled with diastolic blood pressures of over 100. What happened to them? At the end of the 4-week program, this high-risk group had dropped their average diastolic blood pressure by 18 points. And at the same time, only 69 out of the original 210, or 33%, had to remain in this high-risk category. That's good news. That means we can do our part as we work with our physicians and work together to bring these blood pressures down. Now let's summarize. We have learned that there are things that we can do to lower blood pressures and to prevent them from going up. Number 1, reduce sodium to less than 1,500 milligrams a day. Number 2, increase potassium-rich foods. Number 3, reduce cholesterol levels to open up our arteries. And then you have number 4, get rid of excess weight. Number 5, get physically active and fit. And number 6, and watch out for alcohol. These are the principles that will take the pressure off and keep it off. And whether we look at the clinical results from the Predicament Longevity Center or the results of the DASH diet or at our clinical CHIP results, studies have shown the tremendous impact that lifestyle can have on our blood pressure.
So what we've discovered is that plant-based foods are naturally low in sodium, and that's fantastic. But the question that's often asked is, are they also low in other nutrients that we actually need, such as protein? Well, perhaps we need to redirect that question to a 300-pound muscle-bound gorilla who essentially consumes these sorts of foods every meal. But can you? Can you achieve enough protein on plant-based diet? Let's take a closer look.
Do we get enough protein from a plant-based diet? Absolutely. Plant foods do contain plenty of protein. Most people you talk to would say no. It is a common misconception among consumers and health professionals that a plant-based diet cannot contain enough protein. Plant-based diet provides an appropriate level of total dietary protein, around 10% of total calories. That proportion exceeds the level required for most people. The word malnutrition caused by a protein deficiency is not even known to the vast number of countries, including Australia, Canada, and the United States of America, only where there are food shortages and starvation. Plant foods contain protein in different amounts. Legumes and nuts are particularly rich, but vegetables and whole grain cereals eaten throughout the day also contribute greatly to our protein intake. With some planning, and with that I mean buying and preparing a variety of foods, a plant-based diet can easily meet the recommended protein needs of adults and children. What is the role of protein? Proteins are a major structural component of muscle and other body tissues and are used to produce hormones, enzymes, and hemoglobin. An adequate dietary intake of protein is important for so many things, including essential for growth and repair of body cells, the normal function of muscles, transmission of nerve impulses, and immunity. Protein can also be used as energy, but is not the body's preferred energy source. So this occurs only when the amounts of carbohydrates and fats consumed are insufficient. And this can be an expense of tissue maintenance, growth and repair, and immune function. The body prefers to use carbohydrates and fat for energy. Burning carbohydrates for energy is like burning dried pine. It burns hot and fast. Burning fat is like burning hardwood, not as hot, but it burns longer. Burning protein is like burning car tires, and the body has a hard time mopping up the smoke and debris. Your kidneys have to work overtime to flush the toxins, and hence this is why high protein diets can be so damaging. They do make you lose weight quickly, but it is in the form of the water that your kidneys excrete, trying to put out the toxic flames. How much protein do we need? We don't actually need as much protein as you may think. In fact, too much protein may also have negative effects. So how did our preoccupation with protein start? In the 1800s, Carl Voigt made the first recommendation on required protein, stating it was 120 grams per day. By 1905, research into protein had progressed, and Chittenden revised the requirement to 60 grams per day. By 1913, a Danish physiologist, Dr. Hein Hindi, had proposed the requirement of 40 grams per day. By 1920, the belief was we need only 35 grams. By 1955, it was proposed only 20 grams was needed. Currently, the World Health Organization recommends that a healthy adult should aim for 0.83 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight, which is about 62 grams for a man who is 75 kilograms and 50 grams of protein for a woman who is 60 kilograms. While over a century ago, it was believed that we all needed at least 120 grams of protein daily, today the recommendation suggests we need much less than this. And if enough calories are eaten as part of a varied plant-based diet, enough protein can also be consumed. How much protein does an average person consume today? Have a look at the breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and if you add up all these protein sources, it works out to be 140 grams of protein. In the more recent past, it was believed that specific plant foods needed to be combined at meals for their protein to be useful. We now know that if a wide range of plant foods are eaten across the day, the body is quite capable of efficiently using the protein they contain. Another reason plant foods are the optimal source of protein is because of the whole package you get while eating plant foods. Protein-rich whole plant foods are often a great source of fiber and contain a wide range of protective phytonutrients. Protein-rich animal foods, on the other hand, contain no fiber, no phytonutrients, and can also be high in unhealthy saturated fats, contain trans fats, and they contribute to cholesterol. Good plant-based sources of protein, such as legumes, beans, lentils, chickpeas, and many more, are also packed with an array of beneficial nutrients. Studies have shown high consumption of legumes to be related to a whole host of health benefits. A number of studies have shown high consumption of red and processed meats to be associated with a range of negative health effects. It is important that we look at the whole package of food. What do these people have in common? They are all world-class elite athletes. These athletes fill up and strive on beans, legumes, whole grains, vegetables, nuts, and seeds. When people hear a person is a vegetarian, the first thought being, where do you get your protein? It's so predictable. These athletes prove our bodies can function at their best by getting protein from sources other than meat and dairy products. While protein is vital to numerous functions, including muscle movement, repairing and making new cells, transporting oxygen in the blood, hormone functions, and fighting germs, a protein deficiency would, among other things, cause a loss of muscle mass, something not found in the best of class athletes. They report feeling and performing at their best and having more stamina, being more focused, and quicker recovery times between workouts. The myth, the more protein, the better, may be just that, a myth. Bypass the saturated fat and cholesterol found in meat and dairy products. Like these athletes, you can get your protein from eating adequate amounts of beans, legumes, nuts, seeds, vegetables, and fruits.
Okay, what an interesting combination, talking about blood pressure and protein in the same video. So let me just ask one question about the blood pressure, and then I want to ask you a little bit about the protein. So what was the threshold for the pre-hypertension? Remember, so the normal high blood pressure is 120/80. I really don't have any doubt that everybody here knows that. But what was the threshold where it's considered to be hypertension so that the range between 120 and that number is pre-hypertension? 140/90, that's correct. And what percentage, do you remember the number of people that were, when they did a survey or questionnaire of, they found that out of the 65 million people that had high blood pressure, what number was it that didn't know that they even had it? Remember, it was 20 million. So 20 million out of 65 million. So that's like, what? That's between a quarter and a third of all of us. So that's why we have health screenings where you can get your blood pressure checked because there are no symptoms of the pre-hypertension. The typical person would never know. And even if your blood pressure creeps up slowly over time so that you can have a very high blood pressure, 165 over, what was it, 95, I think was in the DASH study, and you wouldn't even have any awareness of that. And yet, there is a risk, even though there are no obvious symptoms. Okay, so now I want to ask you a couple questions about the protein. What are in the plant foods, what are the two types, or there's probably more than two, but let's name two that have higher protein content, so that we want to make sure that we include these kind of foods in our diet if we are eating exclusively plants. Remember what they were? Legumes or beans, right? Very good. And nuts, right? And it didn't mention seeds, but seeds fall in the same category. So legumes or beans, of course, beans are only one kind of legume. There's lentils and other kinds, fava beans and so on. And nuts. Let me ask you, what is the biggest danger in a first world country of eating nuts? And it relates to the first part of this video, which was about hypertension. What do we do to our nuts that makes them actually not good for our blood pressure? Yeah, they're commonly salted and oil. They put a little oil on them so that the salt will stick to it. And so if you do eat nuts, it'd be much better to get them raw and unsalted to avoid this problem. And where does most of the salt come from in where we get too much salt in our diet? Is it from salting at the table? Not really. And that's why I connect this with the nuts. Many people will eat nuts because, well, I need protein and I'm a plant diet, but they're getting salt without thinking about that aspect of it. By the way, it's a little confusing about how much salt or sodium to have, because sodium is what is the problem, okay? The sodium in the salt. Salt is sodium chloride. It's the sodium that's the problem, and sodium is much lighter than chloride. And so what happens is we recommend, the health authorities recommend, say, 1,500 milligrams of sodium, but how much salt is that? Some people, so it's, I mean, if you remember your chemistry or whatever, you could figure this out. You could calculate it using the molecular weight, but we won't do that. That's not a chemistry class. The answer is about 5,000 milligrams of salt is roughly equivalent to 1,500 milligrams of sodium. So when I tell people, I say, well, here's the bottom line. If you will, because on the packages, food labels, it's going to tell you not the amount of salt, it's going to tell you the amount of sodium. So here's what you do. It's real easy. You just say you don't want to have any more milligrams of sodium in the day than you have calories. So if you are a typical woman and you're eating 1,600 calories, and you also eat about 1,500 or 1,600 milligrams of sodium, you're fine. And if you're a man and you're eating closer to 2,000 or whatever calories, again, the 2,000 milligrams is fine. So anyway, it's just a simple way to say, okay, I want my milligrams of sodium to be somewhere around my calories. All right. Is there anyone in the audience here that has a question that you have that I can answer? Oh, good. I see the fan went off. It's a little quieter. Who's got a question about either hypertension or about protein? Oh, there's one over there. You know, you always invite yourself to get into trouble when you have a, but I'll take any question you have.
Okay, so I'm gonna have to unmute this mic. Oh. Okay. So, how many or how much grams of? Oh wait, I'm gonna slow it down a little bit. All right. How much grams of meat, or like specifically turkey, chicken, like, is bad, and like how much of it, how much grams would cause high blood pressure and,
Okay.
and bad pressure for the heart?
Okay, so as I understand your question is, how much meat, and you mentioned turkey and chicken and so forth, would be too much that it could raise your blood pressure?
Yes.
Okay, well, that's a really good question because there's no right answer. It really, in all seriousness, it does depend on the individual and how those foods are fixed. In general, the main component of harm in those kind of foods is not actually the sodium, unless there are, like in the old days, they used to preserve meat by salting it, and it was very high in salt, and it was a small amount even could raise blood pressure. But today, that's not generally how it's done. The biggest problem with those foods today is when they're processed and highly refined. Like if you want to make, help me someone, I forget the name of it, when we used to have it when I was a kid. It was like a paste from processed meat. I'm blanking on the name of it. But anyhow, the biggest issue with the animal foods today is not so much the sodium. It's more the saturated fat. There's almost no fat in animal foods other than saturated fat. There's very little polyunsaturated fats in there. And the saturated fats are harmful to our blood vessels and to the rest of our body, actually. So I think we're pretty much out of time. We got one more question? Okay, we'll do one more. And then we want to stop for our taste samples.
So it just really depends on who you are.
Yes, so as a follow-up to that question, he was saying it depends on who you are. Yes, there's so many factors that go into that. Your weight, your health condition, your age. Come in, folks. Welcome. Other things in your diet. So if a person's eating, for example, a lot of plant foods and getting lots of fiber, a modest amount of animal foods is not that problematic. Like he mentioned at the Pritikin Center, they don't use a completely plant-based diet. They have small amounts of animal foods as well. Yes, there's another question. Go ahead.
How do Himalayan salt or the pink salt Celtic salt, iodized salt, how do they compare to each other? I mean, is there anything better?
Well, I'm going to thank you for that question about the different kinds of salt. I'm just going to stick to one particular component, and that is the amount of sodium. There's a lot of other aspects to those salts that one could discuss. But as far as the amount of sodium, to my understanding, there's no difference in the amount of sodium in the salt of whatever type it is. If it's salt, it's sodium chloride. And the source of it and the other things that might be in it, some of them is pink, as you know, some of different kinds. I mean, sea salt has some micronutrients and microelements. But the thing that we're talking about tonight is blood pressure, and that has to do with sodium in the salt. And that's going to be the same no matter which one you use. Okay, thank you. Paula, do you want to tell about the taste samples?
Yes, thank you. So this evening, Carmen is doing our taste samples. And again, we're going to do it in the fellowship hall. And it's a little bit of pico de gallo. So we got some of that and some fruit. So please, you're welcome please help yourself. And again, in the kitchen.
She's losing her voice.
My voice is a mess.
But I
So
mean-
because of that, would you do the
Sure,
grace,
sure.
please?
Let's just have a blessing. Our Father, we're thankful for food and for these things that we're learning night by night to help us have better health. I pray your blessing on the taste samples, and thank you for those who prepared them. In Christ's name, amen.
Thank
All
you.
right,
Thank you,
enjoy.
Dr. John.
Mhm.